Medgar Evers emerges. After the exile of T.R.M. Howard, Medgar Evers emerged as the most visible freedom activist in the state. Evers was born in Decatur, Mississippi in 1925. World War II began during his sophomore year at Newton County High School. The next year, he decided to leave high school at age 17 and enlist in the U.S. Army, along with his older brother Charles. The Evers brothers fought in Europe during World War II and were discharged in 1945. Medgar returned to Decatur and found employment. The year following his discharge, an incident revealed his future as a freedom fighter. With the 1944 U.S. Supreme Court decision undermining the all-white primary, Medgar and Charles decided to register to vote in Decatur. The Evers brothers organized 4 other black World War II veterans from Decatur to vote during the 1946 primary. Word traveled throughout Decatur that the men planned to register and vote. White supremacists threatened the 6 blacks. On the day of the primary, the 6 black veterans were met at the courthouse by a group of some 15 or 20 armed white men who prevented them from entering the building. The white supremacist group grew in number to a mob of 200. The black veterans retreated to their homes to arm themselves and returned to the courthouse with their guns and their vehicles. The veterans again attempted to enter the courthouse and were prevented by the mob. To prevent a bloodbath, the veterans decided not to pursue registering that day. The mob followed the men, but according to one account, Charles Evers brandished his weapon to slow the white pursuit. That evening, Medgar and Charles Evers stood guard at their parents' home, waiting for night riders, who never came. After the incident at the Newton County Courthouse, Evers decided to finish high school at an experimental secondary program at Alcorn A&M, a state-funded historically black college, where his brother Charles was enrolled. After he completed the Alcorn secondary program, Evers enrolled in the undergraduate school in 1948. At Alcorn A&M, he met Merle Beasley, whom he married in December 1951. After graduating from Alcorn in 1952, Medgar and Merle moved to the all-black Delta town of Mound Bayou. In Mound Bayou, Evers became an RCLNL and NAACP activist. The college educated Medgar and Merle Evers became employees of T.R.M. Howard's Magnolia Mutual Insurance Company. His work as an insurance agent and salesman prepared Evers for the grassroots organizing he was to do when building the NAACP chapters throughout the state. Traveling throughout the Delta, Evers witnessed and studied black life in the Delta. The poverty, hunger, hopelessness, and squalor horrified Evers. Through his employment with Magnolia Mutual, Evers began to blend selling insurance with recruiting members and organizing chapters for the NAACP. Evers became a principal organizer of the RCNL's Don't Buy Gas Where You Can't Use the Restroom campaign. Evers first received statewide and national attention when he applied to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss Law School in 1954 as part of an NAACP legal challenge to segregated education. His decision was motivated by a passionate speech by NAACP state leader Dr. Emmett Stringer. Evers also believed that the civil rights movement needed more black attorneys committed to justice. NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall also encouraged Evers to apply. Evers became the target of threats of violence and harassment due to his decision to apply to Ole Miss. The university denied his application, claiming his recommendations came from Bolivar County as opposed to the county of his birth, Newton. This denial led to Evers becoming the principal plaintiff in litigation to desegregate the Ole Miss Law School. Ultimately, the NAACP decided not to pursue the suit because they had another task that would occupy a great amount of his time. A primary focus of the development of the Citizens Council and white supremacist violence of 1954-55 was to undermine the momentum created by the RCNL and NAACP in Mississippi. The economic harassment and terror was directed at the emerging movement to force it underground or out of existence. In October of 1954, the NAACP national leadership made an assessment of the development of its organization in the state. The leadership in the state conference is aggressive and intelligent. The leadership at the local level, however, is typical of NAACP leadership in small towns and cities. In addition, it faces the problem of threats of violence, which has made it difficult for the association to function without continued direction and supervision. The organization decided to make maintaining and building its presence in Mississippi a priority. This would mean committing resources to employ staff members in the state and maintaining a visible presence in spite of its economic harassment and intimidation by the White Citizens Council and the violent terror of white supremacists. In December of 1954, the NAACP Director of Branches announced the hiring of a field secretary and the establishment of a full-time office. The motivation for committing these resources was as follows. With the threatened violence, acts of intimidation, economic boycotts, and the other activities on the part of those who oppose the desegregation program, it is essential that the association, through this office, convey to Mississippians that we are prepared to conduct a high-level program which will enable us to direct and coordinate the various phases of our work, including education and legal action. On December 15, 1954, Medgar Evers assumed the position of field secretary. Evers became the official NAACP spokesperson and organizer in the state. He and his family, which now included 2 children, moved to Jackson, the state capital. Merle Evers took the job of secretary of the Mississippi Field Office in Jackson. The NAACP national leadership also supported the proposal of T.R.M. Howard to establish a fund in a Memphis black-owned bank to support those targeted by the Citizens Council economic intimidation campaign. The decision to hire Medgar Evers as an organizer and make Mississippi a national priority was a smart one. He had previously proven himself as a good recruiter and chapter builder in his work in the Mississippi Delta. The NAACP membership increased in the state during the early days of his employment as field secretary. After the Brown decision, all Deep South states experienced a significant decline in NAACP membership, with the exceptions of Georgia and Mississippi. This was the result of escalating campaigns of repression, harassment, intimidation, and violence by white supremacists. An NAACP memorandum disclosed that between January 1954 and April 1955, Mississippi's NAACP membership increased from 874 to 1,481. The organizational membership declined in Louisiana, negative 1,347. South Carolina, negative 171. Florida, negative 369. And Alabama, negative 587. Being a NAACP leader in apartheid Mississippi was a hazardous venture. With Howard leaving Mississippi, the NAACP became the central human rights organization in the state. Before the post-World War II movement upsurge, the organization operated in a virtually clandestine way in most places in the state. Evers' new visibility made him a primary target of white supremacist terrorists. In the bastion of racist violence, his survival was a tenuous question. Mississippi Mau Mau, the prospect of retaliatory violence. During Evers' years in Mound Bayou, he began to follow African independence movements, particularly the nationalist struggle in Kenya. Prior to assuming the position of NAACP field secretary, Evers envisioned the development of guerrilla warfare. He dreamed of forming a clandestine black commando unit based in the Kikuyu Land and Freedom Army, popularly known as the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau was an underground, peasant-based resistance movement that led a popular uprising between 1953 and 1956 in British colonial Kenya. Although the Mau Mau was defeated militarily, their revolt was credited with breaking the British resolve to directly colonize Kenya. After the outbreak of the revolt, Evers closely followed the Mau Mau uprising in the press and greatly admired Kenyan nationalist and suspected Mau Mau leader Jomo Kenyatta. Evers shared his plan to establish a Mississippi Mau Mau with close friends, family, and NAACP officials. The Mississippi Mau Mau would retaliate against perpetrators of racist violence on blacks. Evers' strategy was to use guerrilla warfare to bring national and international attention to the freedom struggle and the horrors of segregation, not to defeat white supremacy in Mississippi militarily. Evers did not win much support for this idea and focused his energies on the traditional NAACP methods, exposing the violations of white supremacy in the media and promoting litigation. As NAACP Field Secretary, Evers would come to distance himself from his ideas about retaliatory violence. John Salter, Jackson activist and advisor to the NAACP Youth Council, described Evers as being in the middle. He was between local activists who wanted to engage in civil disobedience and the conservative national NAACP movement. The strategy of NAACP national leadership was to rely on litigation and efforts to influence public opinion, which would ultimately affect politicians, particularly on the federal level and the commercial community. Their position often subordinated and discouraged the tactics and initiatives of local activists, but controlled campaigns coordinated on a national level by utilizing lobbying, media campaigns, and litigation. Local militants were more inclined to utilize disruptive tactics, particularly civil disobedience and boycotts, in order to pressure local white power structures. The conciliatory posture of the NAACP national leadership created tension with local militants. Evers often identified and sympathized with local leadership, but due to his organizational position, he was compelled to publicly articulate the perspective of the NAACP national leadership. Likewise, Evers' position constrained his public posture on armed resistance. The NAACP had historically supported the right of black people to self-defense. Certainly, the national leadership in New York knew and supported Evers and other Southern NAACP functionaries employing methods of armed self-defense as a means of survival in a hostile environment. In 1947, the NAACP paid for armed security for one of its local leaders, Daisy Bates, during a school desegregation campaign, which drew national attention. On the other hand, the national leadership of the organization was careful not to be identified with insurgent politics and militant armed resistance. The posture of the national leadership concerning armed resistance advocate Robert Williams is an example of its caution on the issue of retaliatory and insurgent violence. In 1959, the NAACP leadership suspended Williams for 6 months for telling the press that black activists should meet violence with violence. Williams' suspension became the focus of a debate at the 1959 NAACP National Convention. The NAACP Council even visited FBI offices in New York to encourage the Bureau to investigate Williams. In 1961, Williams was forced into exile after charges of kidnapping, and a national manhunt was initiated against him. Although never speaking publicly on the issue, Evers expressed sympathy for the exiled advocate of armed resistance. Consistent with his silence on Robert Williams, Evers was publicly deceptive about his previous plans for a Mississippi Mau Mau. In a 1958 interview in Ebony magazine, Evers is quoted as stating that he studied the Mau Mau and Kenyatta when he was in the U.S. Army. However, Evers was enlisted in the U.S. military between 1941 and 1945, whereas the Mau Mau uprising did not begin until 1953, only 5 years prior to the Ebony interview. Evers says in the interview that the Bible convinced him that two wrongs would not make a situation any different, and that I couldn't hate the white man and at the same time hope to convert him. Due to his role as the official voice of the NAACP in Mississippi, Evers was required to distance himself from advocating armed resistance. The emerging popularity and influence of nonviolence advocate Martin Luther King Jr. and the conciliatory posture of the national NAACP leadership made articulating armed insurgents a marginal position in mainstream black politics. Nevertheless, Evers' pro-Mau Mau position was known among some national NAACP leaders. According to Southern Regional Director Ruby Hurley, talk about nonviolent. He was anything but nonviolent, anything but. And he always wanted to go at it in Mau Mau fashion. It is certain that NAACP national leadership discouraged Evers from articulating retaliatory violence and convinced him that a conciliatory approach was best at advancing the freedom movement. Evers was also conscious of public relations and image. He understood that a win federal and Northern liberal support was not good public relations to publicly demonstrate anger towards racists. He believed it was necessary to publicize Mississippi's crimes against people of African descent to win support outside the state and to pressure the white power structure to eliminate segregation. Evers wanted to project the image of Mississippi blacks as victims of white terrorist violence. Like Howard, Evers played a significant role in bringing national and international attention to the Emmett Till case. He would investigate and publicize many other offenses against Mississippi blacks, including the 1959 lynching of Mac Parker in the small Mississippi town of Poplarville. He also played a leading role in assisting individuals and communities of color to take action in order to gain access to educational institutions that had to be designed white only, including the successful effort to admit James Meredith to the University of Mississippi in 1962. Movement leaders believed retaliatory violence could jeopardize white liberal support for the civil rights movement and inspire increased reactionary violence from white supremacists. Evers and the NAACP State Conference condemned black retaliatory violence in the northern Mississippi towns of Tupelo and North Albany in November 1958. On Halloween of that year, 8 white teenagers armed with shotguns murdered one black youth and wounded another. It was suspected that a series of stabbings of whites, which occurred on November 15th and 16th in Tupelo, were responses to the Halloween shooting. On November 17th, three black youths, T.L. Carruthers, J.B. Little, and Otto Jones, were arrested for the stabbings. The youths were reportedly members of a youth organization called the Jayhawkers, named for a pre-Civil War anti-slavery movement in Kansas and Missouri. Around the same time, in New Albany, it was reported that the black youth were throwing rocks at a young white female. The Mississippi chapter of the NAACP responded on the day of the arrest of Carruthers, Little, and Jones. Evers and his colleagues stated, "We deplore violence in Tupelo and New Albany, allegedly by Negroes, as we do violence in Corinth, Poplarville, and money by whites." The NAACP was also concerned with the mobilization of white civilians in response to black retaliatory violence. "We also deplore the use of private white citizens armed to carry out the functions of duly elected and appointed law enforcement officers in solving the incidents in Tupelo and New Albany." Evers himself understood the anger of blacks in response to white terrorist violence. After the lynching of Mac Parker, Evers told his wife Merle, "I'd like to get a gun and start shooting." On the other hand, Evers' perspective and actions were restrained due to his accountability to the NAACP national leadership, and his understanding that spontaneous and reactive violence could retard the movement. Evers in armed self-defense. Although Evers abandoned his plans to build a secret black commando unit, he continued to practice armed self-defense in his organizing. Like T.R.M. Howard, Evers and other NAACP activists realized that they had to rely on their own resources to protect themselves. Evers was a known and targeted activist throughout the state. His field work had him driving all over the state. In urban and rural places, he facilitated the building of new chapters and strengthening existing ones, as well as investigating atrocities of white supremacists. Wherever Evers went, he was armed. He commonly rode with a .45 semi-automatic handgun. Ruby Hurley spent many days with Evers driving on Mississippi roads, investigating violations of civil and human rights. Many times, when Medgar and I would drive together, Medgar would tell about carrying his gun. He used to sit on it under a pillow, Hurley remembered. The NAACP Southeast Regional Director was uncomfortable with Evers' routine possession of firearms. Evers not only needed security in the field, but his Jackson family home required protection. A security network was formed in the state capitol to protect Evers and local NAACP leaders, including Sam Bailey and Robert T. Smith. Carolyn Tyler was Smith's secretary and the Jackson NAACP chair of voter registration for women. Tyler stated that Evers, Bailey, and Smith were routinely assigned armed security. She remembered they were never supposed to go anywhere alone. There was always someone with them. She described the security team as big, burly men, provided for by the NAACP. According to Bailey, Evers' detail was composed of 3 to 4 men to secure his home and to travel with him. A veteran of the NAACP since the 1940s, Sam Bailey described the home protection. Bailey explained that security was placed on alert after information was received that an attack was imminent. Armed guards protected the home of targeted individuals during the evenings. The visible presence of whites would naturally draw attention in a segregated environment, particularly when racial tensions were high. The security team would place armed guards in automobiles across the street from the home they were protecting. Other defense guards sat on the porch of the house. The armed guard would look at stray cars coming down the street. The visibility of security would deter the invading terrorists who noticed the presence of armed guards. That white man, he wasn't going to get no blood if he can help it, because they know we would shoot, reminisced Bailey over 30 years later. Armed security was also organized to protect special guests and the NCAA leaders such as Roy Wilkins, NAACP President Gloucester Current, Director of Branches, Attorney Thurgood Marshall, and Lena Horne, entertainer and friend of the Civil Rights Movement. Besides personal security, protection was also organized for Jackson NAACP mass meetings. The entrances were secured and sentries posted near the podium between the audience and the leadership, who generally sat facing members and supporters in the audience. In addition to assistance from local NAACP members and supporters, Evers, who owned several guns, was also prepared to defend his family and home from violent racists. NAACP activists were on alert at all times due to the white supremacist violent response that erupted at the University of Mississippi due to the admission of James Meredith to the university. John Salter remembered coming to the Evers home in 1962. Evers greeted Salter at the door with a weapon, stating, "We were expecting the wrong type of people." Upon entering the house, Salter observed half a dozen guns in the kitchen and living room. Furniture was stacked behind each window in the house. The Evers household also had windows with bulletproof blinds. Murley and the 3 Evers children were instructed to immediately fall to the floor if they heard the screech of car brakes outside the home. The Evers also purchased a German Shepherd for protection. A week before his fatal shooting, the Evers household was once again on alert. Evers would instinctively vault from bed armed with one of his many rifles when awakened by the barks of his guard dog. Murley Evers also slept with a small revolver on the nightstand of her bed. The Evers had good reason to believe the family was in danger. They received threatening phone calls and mail, and a firebomb was tossed at their home in spring 1963. Unfortunately, the precautions and defenses practiced by Evers, his family, and his comrades could not save him from the bullet of his assassin, Byron de la Beckwith. Witnesses observed de la Beckwith at a Jackson NAACP mass meeting on June 11, 1963. The white supremacists had attended NAACP mass meetings before, sitting with the media. Around midnight that evening, Evers returned home by himself after a Jackson NAACP mass meeting. Murley and the Evers children were at home waiting up for him. Unfortunately, Evers had no personal security trailing him. The Jackson police, who often followed him home, were nowhere to be found. Evers was shot by a high-powered rifle immediately after leaving his car. A neighbor, Houston Wells, after hearing the shots and the screams of Murley Evers, went to his bedroom window to see Evers lying on the ground bleeding. Wells got his handgun and fired a shot in the air for the purpose of frightening away the sniper. Evers somehow was able to stagger to his kitchen door, where he collapsed by the steps. Wells and other neighbors, after covering Evers with a blanket and placing him in a station wagon, transported him to the hospital. Evers died shortly after arriving at the hospital. It is possible that having security that night might have prevented Beckwith's assassination plans. And it is unclear why he was not accompanied by bodyguards. Sam Bailey lamented, Evers was supposed to have a bodyguard carrying him home. I do not know what happened to him. I guess he got careless. Mississippi Negroes with guns. Chicago-based journalist Simeon Booker visited Mississippi to observe the RC&L rallies and the Emmett Till trials. From Booker's perspective, Howard's and Evers' armed preparedness with weapons and security posture were not exceptions in the Mississippi Black freedom struggle. Firearms, protection, and security are ingredients of a successful civil rights program in Mississippi, wrote the Black journalist. Booker's observations recognized the role of armed resistance in the survival of the struggle. The journalist reflected, the Negro social reformer must defend himself because he has no protection from police, sheriffs, or state troopers. He must be ready to die at any moment. The reason many more Negro civil rights are not killed is because they are armed to defend themselves and their families. Booker's observations revealed that armed self-defense was common practice for Southern Black activists. The practice of Howard and Evers demonstrate that Robert Williams' incorporation of armed resistance in North Carolina was not exceptional in the Southern Black freedom struggle. Evers, like Williams, had views that were potentially radical and less optimistic about the possibility of peaceful integration. Both Evers and Williams believed in the possibility of a race war and were prepared for it. The escalation of violent hostility by white supremacists led Evers and Williams to question the possibility of a peaceful transition of human rights and dismantling of apartheid. Years before Williams, Evers considered the possibility of an independent black state in the Southern Black Belt to prevent genocide. Murley Evers said her husband considered, if white structural racism was relatively permanent, what practical options or alternatives did African Americans have? Perhaps blacks should consider demanding a separate all-black state of their own, based on a territorial separation between the races. Medgar believed you must always be prepared for whatever comes our way. And we were talking about guns, the arms, collecting what we needed to fight, if by chance we ended up in a race war, which he felt could possibly happen. He was thinking about building a nation of black people. Evers' perspective was obviously private, given his position with the NAACP. More autonomous from the national leadership, Williams openly advocated armed self-defense and retaliatory violence. Issuing statements from exile in Cuba, China, and Tanzania, Williams would echo Evers' private thoughts and called for armed guerrilla warfare to protect black people from a white supremacist genocidal pogrom. Williams would embrace the demand of the Nationalist Republic of New Africa to establish an independent black nation state in the Deep South. Evers became the symbolic martyr of the Mississippi movement. His was a complex personality, his public persona contrasting with his private comments and practices concerning armed resistance. The image-conscious leader created a public portrait of himself as a tireless soldier who did not hate his enemy. Although this image is not inconsistent with armed self-defense, he realized that the majority of the white American public, whether in the North or in the South, was threatened by the image of Negroes with guns. The image of Evers as an armed militant was inconsistent with the strategy and objectives of the national NAACP leadership. The perception of Negroes with guns would not win white liberal or federal support. It was necessary for Evers to have an image of one who was willing to sit down and resolve problems with segregationists to bring racial harmony. Two white supremacists, Howard and Evers, were bad Negroes who had to be killed or exiled. Although he certainly lived as a bad Negro in defiance of white domination, Evers was also a trickster. He concealed his belief in and practice of armed resistance, as well as his dissatisfaction with nonviolence. Although Evers realized that the image of armed blacks was not good public relations, he possessed weapons as a matter of survival.